Chapter 1. Just a friend. Just a fool. The Moretti name had always carried weight. Tony knew it the way some men knew their pulse, an unshakable constant. From the moment he stepped into the grand hall of the Italian charity gala, the familiar hush followed him, as though his very presence bent the atmosphere. Chandeliers glittered like frozen fireworks overhead, scattering flecks of gold and silver over silk gowns and black tuxedos. The music was tasteful, the champagne endless, and the conversation smooth as honey, except for the pounding of his own heart. He should have been calm. After all, tonight wasn't just another society gala. It was supposed to be a beginning. Blake Blackthorne's arm rested casually around his as they entered the ballroom, a touch that felt far too casual for what it represented to Tony. He dressed with care tonight, a tailored velvet suit in deep navy, cut to flatter his lean frame. His soft brown hair had been brushed back, his hazel eyes shining with the warmth that came so naturally to him, even when he was nervous. He wasn't naive. He knew Blake wasn't perfect, that the man thrived on attention and power games. But he had given Blake something real, his heart, his trust, his body. And tonight, Blake had promised. Promised this was the night he would acknowledge them, that their secret wasn't going to be a secret anymore. The thought made Tony's chest warm as they slipped through the clusters of aristocrats and moguls. He allowed himself a small, private smile. "Champagne?" Blake murmured, plucking 2 glasses from a passing waiter. His smile was camera-ready, sharp enough to cut glass. He was devastating in a perfectly cut white tuxedo jacket, his dark hair styled into deliberate disarray. Blake thrived in rooms like this. He was born for them. Tony tried to believe Blake meant to share that world with him. They drifted toward a journalist Tony recognized from La Voce di Roma, a sharp woman with a notebook tucked against her clutch. Blake shook her hand, pulling Tony a half-step closer. "This is Tony," Blake began. Tony felt anticipation flutter like wings in his stomach. This was it. His name, his place, acknowledged before all of Rome's glittering elite. "Just a close friend," Blake finished smoothly, a laugh in his voice. The word rang out, slicing through the music. Friend. Not partner. Not boyfriend. Not anything that mattered. The journalist's smile flickered with amusement, her pen scratching. Around them, the polite chuckles of bystanders filled the air. Tony felt his skin go hot, his ears burning. He swallowed, forcing his lips into the faintest curve of a smile, though his insides crumbled. A friend. That was what he was after years of loyalty. A bed to warm when convenient. A secret to deny when inconvenient. Blake didn't even notice the way Tony's fingers slipped from his arm. "Excuse me," Tony murmured, his voice steady despite the tremor in his chest. He set the untouched champagne flute on a tray and walked away with measured steps, refusing to let his humiliation show. The hallway was cooler, quieter. Golden light spilled from wall sconces onto marble floors, the muffled laughter from the ballroom trailing after him like knives. He leaned against the wall, pressing his palm flat to the stone to ground himself. He hated how badly it hurt. He hated that his chest felt hollow, that he wanted to cry like a fool. He had given Blake everything, his time, his tenderness, his devotion. And Blake had dismissed him with a single word. "Just a friend," Tony whispered bitterly to himself. "Just a fool. Not a fool." The voice came from behind him, low and edged with steel. Tony turned, startled. Callum Blackthorne stood at the end of the hall, the polar opposite of his charming stepbrother. Taller, broader, dressed in a severe black suit with a crisp white shirt, no tie. His dark hair was slicked back neatly, revealing sharp cheekbones and a jaw that could have been carved from marble. His cufflinks gleamed silver in the light, understated but expensive. His eyes, gray, cold as a winter sea, were fixed on Tony with unnerving precision. He held 2 glasses of whiskey, amber liquid catching the glow. With deliberate steps he closed the distance between them. "I saw what he did," Callum said, voice dry as he extended a glass. "He's a coward, but I'm not." Tony hesitated, hazel eyes flicking from the whiskey to Callum's face. He'd met Callum before, of course, brief, distant encounters across rooms like this one. Everyone knew Callum, the ruthless heir, the man whose boardroom victories left competitors bleeding. Where Blake charmed, Callum commanded. Where Blake smiled, Callum smirked. "I don't need your pity," Tony said, though his hand trembled slightly as he accepted the glass. "This isn't pity," Callum replied, taking a slow sip of his own drink. His gaze never left Tony's. It's opportunity. Tony raised a brow. Opportunity? To wipe that smug look off Blake's face, Callum said evenly. Come with me to his next event, as my date. Watch him choke on it. The words hung in the air like smoke. Tony's heart twisted. He knew the game Callum played. The war between the Blackthorn stepbrothers was infamous, a battle of inheritance and influence fought in boardrooms and tabloids. To Callum, he was another weapon to wield, another dagger aimed at Blake's ego. He should have walked away. He should have said no. But then, as if summoned by the thought, Blake's laughter drifted from the ballroom. Tony glanced through the open doorway and saw him leaning in too close to a socialite, flashing the same practiced grin he had once reserved for Tony alone. The sight was a blade to the ribs. Tony's spine straightened. His humiliation hardened into resolve. He turned back to Callum, hazel eyes steady now, burning with something fiercer than pain. He raised his glass in a slow, deliberate motion. "Let's play," he said softly. For the first time, Callum's mask shifted. Not into warmth, not yet, but into the faintest spark of satisfaction, as if Tony had passed some private test. He lifted his glass in return, the clink between them echoing like a pact. "To war," Callum murmured, their eyes locked, Tony's fire against Callum's frost, and something unspoken settled between them. Not friendship, not trust. Something more dangerous. Something neither of them had planned for. The war had begun. Chapter 2. A war that smells like you. The purr of an engine cut through the quiet of the Moretti estate courtyard as headlights swept across the marble fountain. Tony straightened the cuff of his cream suit, his reflection caught in the glimmering water. He had chosen the suit carefully. Understated, compared to the glittering attire most would wear to a Blackthorn affair, but radiant in its simplicity. It draped fluidly along his lean frame, his skin warmed by the soft tones. He had wanted to look untouchable tonight. If Blake was going to see him again, he would see him shining. The sleek black Aston Martin curved around the drive, every inch of it gleaming menace and control. The door swung open, and Callum stepped out. Black on black. The tailored suit, the shirt, the shoes polished to a mirror shine. Even his watch was an austere statement of power. Callum moved like a man who had never known the word hesitation, his stride calculated, his posture immaculate. And then his eyes landed on Tony. For a fraction of a second, so brief Tony nearly doubted it, Callum faltered. His gaze swept the length of him, lingering at the silk lapel, the way the suit's cream lightened his hazel eyes, the line of his throat. His jaw flexed, and something unguarded flickered there before vanishing behind cold indifference. "You're punctual," Callum said, his voice smooth, though quieter than expected. Tony met his gaze evenly, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "I was raised not to keep people waiting." Callum's mouth curved at that, though not in a way that resembled amusement. He opened the passenger door for him without another word. Tony slid in, his heart drumming harder than it should have as the door clicked shut. Inside the car, silence reigned, but not the easy kind. It was thick, charged, the scent of leather and Callum's clean, expensive cologne saturating the air. Tony kept his eyes forward, determined not to notice the way Callum's gaze slid over to him now and then, like a man checking the weight of a weapon he hadn't meant to pick up. The Blackthorn estate loomed when they arrived, sprawling and decadent, its gilded windows glowing against the night. Tonight, it hosted yet another of Blake's carefully curated high-society cocktail nights, a place where power was bought with a smile and lost with a single misstep. When they entered, Callum offered his arm. Tony hesitated for only a breath before slipping his hand onto it. The effect was immediate. Gasps rippled through the crowd like wind through tall grass. Faces turned. Conversations faltered. Blake froze mid-laugh, his glass tipping dangerously in his hand. For a moment, Tony thought it might actually shatter. Callum leaned down, his lips brushing close to Tony's ear, his voice low enough that no one else could hear. "Smile for him. He's boiling." Tony's mouth curled instinctively, though his chest ached. He forced his shoulders back, let the confidence he didn't feel flicker across his face. Callum's hand pressed lightly against the small of his back, possessive, guiding. The pressure was meant to play a part, but it lingered longer than necessary. Tony's heart twisted. He knew he was being used, a pawn in Callum's endless war with Blake. Yet as he caught sight of Blake's darkening scowl, the sting of betrayal inside him eased, if only slightly. For once, he wasn't powerless. For once, Blake looked unsettled. And God, it felt good. The night stretched in polished conversation and crystal glasses. But beneath the surface, the atmosphere was a taut string. Callum didn't touch him more than was required, yet every brush of his hand felt deliberate. Every glance lasted a second too long. When the orchestra struck the first notes of a waltz, Callum turned to him. "Dance with me." It wasn't a request. Tony's throat tightened. He should have refused. Yet he found himself following Callum onto the marble floor, slipping easily into his hold. The world narrowed to the press of Callum's palm against his back, the firm grasp of his hand around Tony's. The music was slow, sweeping, and though they moved flawlessly, it didn't feel rehearsed. It felt intimate. They locked eyes. Gray storm meeting hazel warmth. "It looks convincing," Tony murmured, though his voice betrayed the flutter beneath. Callum's thumb stroked lightly across his knuckles, an absent gesture that sent a tremor up Tony's arm. "Convincing, Tony swallowed hard. Almost too much. The heat in Callum's gaze deepened, though his expression remained schooled. "Good." From across the room, Blake's fury burned like a visible flame. Later, Tony stepped out for air, the cool night settling on his overheated skin. The estate's garden stretched in sculpted hedges and fountains, moonlight dusting the marble. He drew a steadying breath, only to hear footsteps approach. "Tony." Blake's voice, sharp with anger, cut through the quiet. He strode toward him, jaw tight, glass still clutched in one hand. "What are you doing with him?" Blake demanded, low but harsh. "He'll chew you up and spit you out, you know that." Tony met his gaze, refusing to look away. For years, Blake had owned the room, owned the story of them. But tonight Tony was done being hidden. "Better that," Tony said evenly, "than being invisible." Blake's face flickered. Anger, shock, then something darker. He opened his mouth, but Tony was already turning away. The ride home was quiet. The hum of the city muffled by the car's tinted glass. Tony sat with his hands folded in his lap, his pulse still thrumming. He could feel Callum's gaze on him. Finally, Callum reached over, his fingers brushing a strand of Tony's hair back from his forehead. The gesture was startlingly gentle for a man like him. His voice was low, almost rough. "You're better at this than I thought." Tony turned, lips parting slightly. His breath caught at the closeness of him. The sharp line of his jaw, the unreadable storm in his gray eyes. "It's not acting," Tony whispered, his voice barely audible. The space between them shrank. Their faces lingered inches apart, the weight of the moment pressing heavy, electric. But neither moved closer. Not yet. The car continued on through the night, and the silence was louder than any words. Chapter 3. You Kiss Like You Mean It. The flashes of the cameras still burned behind Tony's eyelids, sharp as lightning bolts. He could feel the phantom grip of Callum's hand on his waist, the way Callum had leaned down during the staged press photo shoot and whispered lines that weren't meant for the world, but for Blake. Lines sharp as daggers. Lines that made Tony feel less like a man and more like a weapon. And God, he hated himself for letting it happen. By the time they returned to Callum's penthouse, Tony's smile had cracked at the edges. He peeled himself away from the glossy veneer of photographers and sycophants, storming past the sleek marble counters and glass walls of Callum's empire in the sky. His chest ached with every step until he shoved open the rooftop doors, letting the night air cut through him. The city sprawled below, Rome's skyline alive with amber lights, domes and spires glowing against the indigo night. It should have been beautiful. Instead, it felt suffocating. Tony braced his palms on the cool glass railing, his reflection staring back at him in fractured shards. His chest rose and fell too quickly. He hadn't wanted to cry in front of Blake. He hadn't wanted to break in front of Callum. But here, on this rooftop, with the world glittering below, he let the words tear out of him. "I'm not your pawn." The rooftop door clicked open behind him, soft but inevitable. He didn't need to turn to know who it was. Callum's presence filled the space like a storm cloud, silent, heavy, impossible to ignore. "You knew what this was," Callum said, his voice flat, though the faint rasp of it betrayed something beneath. Tony spun to face him, eyes flashing. "Then why do you look at me like you mean it?" The words hit the air like a slap. For a moment, Callum didn't move. His face remained a mask, sharp lines, unreadable eyes. But his jaw tightened and the muscle ticked once. In 2 strides, Callum was in front of him. The air shifted, charged, his cologne wrapping around Tony like smoke. Tony backed into the glass wall, his breath catching as Callum's arm came up, palm pressing against the pane beside his head. Not trapping, not threatening, just there, firm, steady, unavoidable. Tony's heart hammered. He should have shoved him back, demanded answers, walked away. Instead, his gaze dropped to Callum's mouth before he could stop himself. Callum saw it. His control frayed in the crack of a second. He kissed him. It wasn't soft at first. It was fire meeting fire, sharp and rough, Callum's lips crushing against his as if trying to erase every false smile from the evening. Tony gasped against him, his body jolting with shock and then melting, helpless, into the heat. His hands found Callum's lapels, clutching, pulling him closer when he should have pushed away. The kiss slowed, softened, shifted. Callum's mouth moved against his with a tenderness that undid him, with a reverence Tony hadn't expected from a man like him. Tony trembled, a sound escaping his throat, half sigh, half plea. Callum deepened the kiss once more, then pulled back as though the contact burned. His chest rose and fell with uncharacteristic unevenness, his gray eyes dark with something unguarded. "You should stay away from me," Callum said, the words more a confession than a warning. Guilt carved lines into his face. Tony's lips were swollen, his breath ragged, his heart stumbling in his chest. He stared up at him, eyes wide, voice a whisper barely held together. "Then why do you keep pulling me closer?" The silence stretched between them, taut and intimate, broken only by the hum of the city below. Callum stepped back suddenly, running a hand over his face as if wrestling with himself. He turned away, the controlled facade snapping back into place, but the crack remained. That night, Tony didn't ask for explanations. He didn't storm out, though part of him wanted to. Instead, when Callum offered a quiet "stay," Tony nodded once, exhaustion and longing twining through him. The penthouse bedroom was all glass and steel, but the sheets were soft, the room warm. Callum lay on one side of the bed, rigid, as if proximity itself was dangerous. Tony hesitated before lying down inches away, staring up at the ceiling. The silence pressed in. The city lights painted shadows across the room. Then, slowly, Tony shifted. He turned onto his side, the space between them disappearing by degrees until his head found Callum's shoulder, tentative as a question. He expected Callum to move, to push him away. Instead, Callum went utterly still. His breath hitched once, then settled, his chest rising and falling beneath Tony's cheek. Tony's eyes fluttered shut. For the first time in weeks, he felt safe. Not vindicated, not used, just safe. Sleep tugged at him, and he let himself drift. Callum did not sleep. He stared at the ceiling long after Tony's breathing evened, the weight of him against his shoulder both an anchor and a chain. He studied the strands of brown hair that had fallen across Tony's forehead, the softness of his lips parted slightly in sleep. And for the first time in years, maybe ever, Blake wasn't on his mind. Callum's throat worked as he whispered into the dark words meant for no one, words he wasn't sure he had the right to speak. "What are you doing to me?" Chapter 4. The Taste of Loyalty. The first headline landed before sunrise. Tony woke to the chiming cascade of notifications shattering the hush of his bedroom, a staccato that made his stomach drop before he'd even reached for the phone. The screen was a wall of links and mentions. Charity Prince or Calculated Climber? Moretti Sion snares Blackthorn Air. The worst one had a photo from last night's press appearance. Callum's hand at Tony's waist. Tony's face turned up toward him, as if tenderness were a trap and Tony the one who said it. He read the opening paragraph once, then again, until the letters blurred. It was cruel in the precise way that felt personal. Cherry-picked rumors, anonymous sources, a timeline bent just enough to make Tony look like the one doing the using. At the bottom, a flourish. Once Blake Blackthorn's close friend, now parading on his stepbrother's arm, an opportunist with expensive taste. His throat tightened. He didn't have to wonder who had orchestrated it. He knew Blake's fingerprints by the polished venom of the tone. The article whipped through the feeds like a match to dry grass. With it came a clatter of texts he ignored. Acquaintances seeking gossip, false friends offering sympathy sweet enough to choke on, 2 cousins forwarding the links in baffled outrage. He set the phone down, palms cold. By the time he showered and dressed in a black turtleneck and slate trousers, armor for a day he hadn't planned, the street below his building had changed. At the window, he saw the vans first, then the lenses. A cluster of paparazzi gathered as if drawn by scent, the rubbery sheen of rain on their jackets, their mouths already moving. He stood very still, watching the set of his own face ghost back at him in the glass. Hazel eyes strained, hair not yet dry, that familiar softness pinned under scrutiny. A message lit up the screen on the table behind him, stern and brief. "Callum, don't go outside. I'm sending a car. 2 minutes." Tony stared at the words until a horn sounded below. It was a low, discreet tone, not the brash blare of impatience. He grabbed his coat and moved, heartbeat thudding in his ears. The elevator opened to a wall of noise. Questions lanced at him as the doors slid wide. "Tony, did you target him? Are you after the Blackthorn fortune? Were you Blake's beard?" He kept his gaze fixed and his face composed, stepping into the spray of flashes as if into rain. A man in a dark suit, Callum's driver, by the earpiece and the compact way he moved, cut a wedge through the crowd. "Mr. Moretti," the man said quietly. "This way." It should have humiliated him. Instead, as the tinted SUV door closed and sound snuffed out like a candle, Tony's first sensation was relief so bright it hurt his eyes. The driver didn't speak during the short ride, and Tony didn't ask. He watched Rome's morning blur by. Scooters hissing over slick cobblestones, cafes exhaling steam and citrus peel, a woman laughing into her scarf. When the car turned into the private garage beneath the Blackthorn building, Tony's chest tightened for a different reason. He hadn't planned to come here. Yesterday's night on the rooftop still burned along the edges of his memory. Callum's mouth, the rough, slow shift of the kiss, the careful way Tony's head had fit against his shoulder when sleep took him. He had left before dawn, a note on the counter. "Thank you. I'll call." He hadn't called. Now the elevator whisked him straight to the executive floor, a corridor of quiet and frames, the carpet muffling his steps. He reached the boardroom door at the exact moment laughter, Blake's particular laugh, slick as a spill, slid under it. Tony meant to wait. He meant to compose himself, to decide whether he even wanted to be seen here, at the heart of their power. But the door was ajar, and through the slice of glass he saw them. The long table, glossy as still water, directors in winter suits, Blake lounging with the carelessness of a prince who'd never been told no, Callum standing on the far end, a sheet of paper crumpling in one fist. Tony didn't hear the prelude. He heard the crack. "This!" Callum's voice was low, a held blade. He slammed the printed article onto the table so hard coffee trembled. The room went very still. "You did this." Blake only smiled, the exact smile he'd used at the gala. "Did I write it?" Heaven, no. He tipped his glass and aimed a look meant to slide off. "But if the shoe fits, don't." The single syllable carried warning and something colder. Callum pinned him with a stare that Tony felt in his bones. "You had him. You ruined him. And now," his hand flattened on the page, "he's mine." The last two words hit Tony the way thunder hits after lightning. Not shock, exactly, but confirmation of an event already seen in the sky. A murmur shivered through the directors. One of the older men shifted. "Callum, public tone. Spare me." Callum said without looking away from Blake. "The company's reputation matters, so does mine. But I will not let my personal life be reduced to a weapon in your campaign. Not again." Blake's eyes darkened. "You've always loved playing knight. How quaint." He leaned back, spreading his hands. "He was never more than a friend. He's an accessory, Callum. Today it's you. Tomorrow, Callum said very softly, "is a day you will spend outside my house." He didn't raise his voice, didn't slam or swear. The restraint made it worse. He gathered the paper in a single motion and looked toward the door as if he were done with the entire building. His gaze flicked and caught on Tony standing in the slit of view. For the briefest moment, the ice in his gray eyes cracked, and there was the man from the rooftop, the one whose control had slipped around the edges of tenderness. He crossed the room in measured steps and opened the door wider. "Come," he said. The driver materialized from nowhere, as if Callum's command could conjure bodies from walls. The directors stared. Blake's stare, knife-bright, tracked Tony like a hawk's. Tony felt heat crowd his chest at the open possessiveness of it. He's mine now, and a quieter ache at the jagged protectiveness underneath. They didn't speak until they were in the elevator, until doors shut and the box hummed upward, not down. "I didn't know you were here," Callum said. It was not apology. It wasn't quite explanation either. "I didn't know I was coming," Tony said truthfully. "Your driver. Because of the press." His jaw worked. He looked like a man bracing against a wave. "I should have anticipated it. I should have." He stopped. "You did," Tony said softly. "You sent for me." Callum's breath left him in a sharp exhale, as if that simple sentence had struck a place without armor. When the elevator doors opened onto his private floor, he rested a hand at the small of Tony's back, only a touch, guiding, and steered him toward a different bank of elevators tucked behind a mirrored alcove. "Not the penthouse?" Tony asked. "No," Callum said. "Somewhere they won't look." The second elevator opened into an underground garage that smelled faintly of oil and rain. Another car waited, sleek, anonymous, the kind of quiet wealth that didn't need to announce itself. They drove without conversation while the city peeled away, narrower streets easing to wider ones, then to the damp ribbon of highway, the windshield stippled by a soft, steady drizzle. Fields rolled out slick and dark, the sky slouched closer. When the first low growl of thunder smudged the horizon, Tony realized where they were going. Not a hotel, not one of the company retreats he'd seen in magazines, but land old enough that the roads curved to keep from bruising it. The estate appeared as the rain thickened. Stone walls furred with ivy, the roofs black slate, the windows lending a warm honey glow to the heavy afternoon. The drive ended in a courtyard cupping a central fountain gone quiet for winter. Callum cut the engine. For a moment, neither of them moved. "It's isolated," Callum said finally. "No staff unless I call. If you don't want—" "I want," Tony said, surprising himself with the ease of it. He did want it, an end to noise, to cameras, to the rasp of strangers' judgment, to Blake's curation of Tony's worth. He wanted, more dangerous to be where Callum was not pretending. Inside, the house was all old bone and quiet breath. Oak beams, broad plank floors, thick-paned windows where the rain made tiny rivers. In the main room, a hearth yawned wide enough to stand in. Callum knelt, suit trousers creasing, and built a fire as if he'd done it all his life. The flint sparked, the kindling caught, the blaze grew with a soft, steady roar. In the rising light, his face looked less severe, the planes gentled, his gray eyes colored amber. "Your clothes," he said, straightening and looking Tony over. The damp cling at the cuffs, the rain darkening the shoulder seam. "You'll freeze. There's a bathroom through there. Towels in the cabinet. I'll find you something dry." "I can," Tony began. "I know." Callum's mouth flicked, almost a smile. "Let me." The bathroom smelled of linen and cedar. Tony stood with the towel draped over his head a moment longer than he needed, breathing in the scent until his pulse calmed. When he stepped back into the sitting room, the fire had shaped the dim into comfort, the rain a softer tapping against glass. Callum held out a charcoal sweater and soft black drawstring pants. "They'll be too large," he said, "but warm." Tony slipped into them, the sweater swallowing his frame. He caught himself smiling at the sight of the cuffs grazing his knuckles. He looked up and found Callum watching him with a gaze he could feel as warmth on skin. "What?" Tony asked, half self-conscious, half pleased. Callum shook his head once. "Nothing. It wasn't nothing. It was everything." But he didn't reach for it yet. They ate what Callum cobbled together, bread warmed by the fire, olives and a wedge of cheese, slices of tomato that tasted like faint summer, though the world outside was rain. They ate on the hearthrug, knees nearly touching, the ancient intimacy of shared food, working its quiet spell. After, they spoke in fits and starts. Not strategy, not war. Small things that built into larger ones. The first book Tony had loved. The bottle of wine Callum had never forgotten. The way both of them found sleep easier near storms. When silence came again, it did not press. It breathed. "I didn't plan this," Callum said at last, his voice quiet enough that Tony had to tip forward to catch it. The fire's glow striped his face. "I mean you. Whatever this is. I intended a clean strike. Hurt him, walk away. That's what we've always done." He paused, mouth tightening. "I don't know how to do this without breaking something." Tony watched him. "Then why try?" "Because the something is me." He lifted his eyes. The honesty in them startled, a winter sea unclouded by storm. "I would rather lose the inheritance than lose you." The words landed with the deep, simple surety of a bell, not poetic. not performative. A fact laid down like a stone. Thunder thudded somewhere beyond the hill. The windows glittered with it. Tony's breath left him, heat flooding his chest in a wave that felt like relief and ache together. He moved before the realization finished forming, because some choices could not live too long in thought without withering. He leaned in. Callum met him halfway. The kiss was not careful this time, not at first. It was the soundless urgency of a door slamming against wind, the jolt of heat after cold. Callum's hand slid to the back of Tony's neck, anchoring, and Tony sighed into his mouth, the sound swallowed by rain and fire. It tasted not of whiskey or victory, but of salt and want, and something Tony could only name as real. He opened under it, then slowed it with his hands at Callum's jaw, palms bracketing the hard line, turning rough to gentle until Callum's breath hitched and softened too. When they broke, it was only to rest, foreheads touching, the air between them humming. "Tell me to stop," Callum murmured. "Don't," Tony said. They rose with unhurried certainty, the kind that felt like a decision both had been moving toward from the first clink of glasses in a gold-lit hallway. The bedroom upstairs was simple and quiet, the windows wide enough to let the storm's breath in. They moved through the shadows not as actors playing a scene, but as men learning how to be handled without harm. Clothes fell in small heaps. The bed took them in and did not creak its secrets to the house. It was not explicit what happened there. It didn't need to be. It was the silken slide of sheets against skin, the map of a shoulder traced by a hand that asked each time and then was answered. The low music of breath and the intimacy of names, traded like vows. Tony felt the press of Callum's heartbeat under his palm and the warmth of his mouth at Tony's throat, a reverent pause that made Tony shiver and laugh quietly at once. Fingers threaded, anchoring. When the storm peaked, the windows rattled, and they held on, not to survive it, but to welcome it. After, the rain gentled to a steady patter that lulled their lungs into one rhythm. They lay without words for a long while, facing each other. Tony had expected complicated feelings, shame, fear, the old reflex to apologize for wanting. There was none of that. There was only a steadiness in his bones, a curious lightness, and the sensation that something brittle in him had finally unclenched. He drifted. When he woke, it was to a quiet that felt like he'd only just found it and already earned it. Fog pressed shyly to glass. The hearth downstairs a faint orange pulse, and, from somewhere near, the aroma of coffee and herbs. The clock on the nightstand insisted it was barely past 7. Tony stretched under the weight of the charcoal sweater he had half pulled back on at some point, a foolish attempt at modesty that made him smile, and padded down the stairs, fingers trailing the banister's smooth wood. He found Callum in the kitchen, barefoot and shirtless, wearing black joggers and a concentration rare on his face outside negotiation. The morning light made his skin look warmer than Tony had ever seen it. Wek pulled gold from the dusting of hair on his forearms. He moved with a care that didn't fit the legend, a precise flip of something in a pan, a hand hovering at the coffee press, a glance to make sure the eggs didn't catch. Tony paused in the doorway, palm braced against the frame, as if to steady himself against a picture too domestic to be believed. Callum looked up, and every hard line in his face eased. "You're awake." "You cook," Tony said, as if he'd discovered a secret passage. "I assemble," Callum corrected, but the corner of his mouth curved. "Sit, please." Tony slid onto a stool, the sweater sleeves falling over his hands. He watched Callum slide herbs into the pan, parsley maybe, or chives, watched him plate toast and eggs with a care that felt, impossibly, like tenderness carved into motion. When the mug of coffee warmed Tony's palms, he realized his shoulders had dropped, his breathing lengthened without his permission. They ate without rush. When Tony reached for the butter, their fingers brushed, and Callum's gaze flicked down, then up, a question and an answer tangled in one look. After, Callum collected the plates and rinsed them, then turned and leaned back against the counter, crossing his arms. It should have made him look closed. It didn't. "You okay?" he asked. Tony was surprised at the honesty that rose without effort. "Better than I've ever been." Callum's mouth softened. He pushed away from the counter and crossed the small distance until they were breathing the same coffee-warmed air. He didn't grab. He didn't demand. He only lifted a hand and brushed his knuckles along Tony's jaw as if the line of it mattered. Some things will get uglier before they get clean, he said. Blake won't stop. The board will fret. There will be more headlines. He exhaled. I was wrong to use you as a weapon. I won't do it again. Tony searched his face. What will you do? Whatever keeps you from being hurt, Callum said simply. Even if it costs me. Rain ticked at the windows like fingertips. The fire in the other room settled, a log collapsing with a soft sigh. Tony could have said a dozen things. He could have asked for promises that would turn to ash the second they hit air. He could have pretended he needed persuasion when he didn't. Instead, he stepped into Callum's space until they were a single breath apart. Callum cupped his face with both hands, so gently Tony's chest tightened, thumbs resting at the hinge of his jaw as if memorizing. The world narrowed to gray eyes and the whisper of heat between their mouths. Stay, Callum murmured. Chapter 5. Wedding Bell Wars. The gala shimmered like a fairy tale built from glass and ego. Crystal chandeliers blazed overhead, the mirrored ballroom reflecting every glint of diamond and every practiced smile. Photographers hovered at the velvet ropes outside, their flashes like distant lightning, waiting for the evening's orchestrated thunderclap. Blake Blackthorne knew how to stage a spectacle. Tonight, the spectacle would be his. But Blake had not accounted for Callum. Or for Tony. When the double doors opened to admit them, conversation faltered. Callum entered first, as though he owned the ground beneath him. And perhaps he did, in ways that mattered. His black tuxedo was cut in deliberate severity, his stride uncompromising. Tony came beside him, hand resting in Callum's with the unstudied grace of someone who didn't need to try to outshine anyone, yet did anyway. Tony's cream and gold suit caught the chandelier light like a flame. His hair was brushed back, the warm brown threaded with glints of copper, his hazel eyes steady as he allowed himself to be seen. Not hidden, not someone's accessory, seen. Gasps rippled across the ballroom, flutes stilled in midair. A woman whispered too loudly, "That's the Moretti boy, isn't it?" Another, bolder, "With Callum?" Blake froze mid-conversation on the dais, a champagne glass balanced in his manicured fingers. For one heartbeat, the mask slipped. The fury that twisted his face was raw enough to scorch. But then it was gone, buried beneath the familiar smile of a man who thought charm was armor. He lifted the glass and struck it lightly, the crystalline chime cutting through the din. "Ladies and gentlemen," Blake said, his voice rolling smooth over the room, "thank you for gathering tonight. Tonight I wish to share something special." He extended his arm, and from the wings of the stage emerged a woman every camera in the city knew. Amara de Vigne, a model and influencer whose social media kingdom rivaled small nations. Her gown was blood-red silk, her lipstick sharper than a blade, her smile flawless and hollow. The crowd gasped again. Flashbulbs cracked like firecrackers. "My engagement," Blake announced, drawing Amara close. The diamond he slid onto her finger gleamed as though it had been polished in anticipation of this moment. "To the woman who will make me the happiest man alive." Applause erupted on cue, a roar, half shocked, half starstruck. Amara waved daintily, her eyes darting to Blake's with the same rehearsed adoration she offered her followers in every photo. But not everyone clapped, because Callum was already moving. He didn't release Tony's hand as he crossed to the stage. His grip tightened, not bruising, but grounding. His stride was measured, unhurried, as if he'd already decided that every eye in the room would follow him, and they did. Conversations faltered. The air thinned. Even Amara's smile flickered. Callum reached the podium where Blake still basked in his carefully staged applause. He didn't take the glass. He didn't take the stage. He simply turned, the mic catching the low cut of his voice. "Forgive the interruption," he said. "There's something I need to say." He looked at Tony. Only Tony. The ballroom hushed. In that cavernous silence, Callum dropped to one knee. A diamond ring, larger, cleaner, more breathtaking than Blake's performative choice, gleamed in his hand. But Callum's eyes weren't on the ring. They were locked on Tony's face, stripped of all his usual frost, open in a way that made Tony's breath catch. "Be mine," Callum said, the words resonant, trembling only in the slightest way that made them truer. "Not for revenge, not for war, for me." The ballroom gasped as one, a tide of disbelief and envy and awe. Tony's throat constricted. He had known Callum as a strategist, a warrior, a man who didn't show his heart even when he was bleeding. But here, in front of the crowd that had laughed at him, dismissed him, mocked him, Callum laid it bare. Tony's eyes blurred. His voice, when it came, was shaky but certain. Yes. The word rang louder than the applause that exploded. Louder than the gasps, the frantic flurry of cameras. Louder than Blake's sharp inhale. Callum slid the ring onto Tony's finger with reverence, then rose and pulled him close. For one suspended moment, the rest of the world didn't exist. Only their hands, linked and trembling. Only Callum's chest rising hard against his own. It was Blake who shattered the moment. He moved quickly, voice low and furious as he grabbed Tony's wrist, pulling him toward the corridor that led to the private garden. "We need to talk." Tony didn't struggle. He let Blake drag him into the cooler air, past manicured hedges and marble statues. The music inside muffled into a throb. "Are you out of your mind?" Blake hissed. His eyes were wild, his smile long gone. "You still love me. Admit it. You always did." Tony laughed then. Not cruelly, not bitterly, softly. "I did love you," he said. "And you destroyed it. Every time you denied me. Every time you hid me. Every time you chose yourself over us." He lifted his hand, the new diamond catching moonlight. "Now I know what real love feels like." Blake's face twisted, caught between fury and disbelief. He reached out, as if touch could reclaim what words could not. But Tony stepped back, the space between them final and sharp. When they returned, Callum was waiting near the dais, expression taut, every muscle wired to intervene. The second Tony stepped into view. Callum moved, closing the distance, taking Tony's hand firmly, pulling him back into the heart of the room where every camera still flashed. And then, without hesitation, Callum kissed him. Not staged, not strategic. A kiss that was possessive and gentle all at once, his hand cradling Tony's jaw as though nothing in the room mattered but him. The applause swelled again, frenzied, the flashes bright as fireworks. Somewhere beyond the chaos, Blake stormed out, Amara trailing with a brittle smile, their spectacle eclipsed. Tony broke the kiss with a breathless laugh, his forehead resting against Callum's. "You're sure about this?" he whispered, though he knew the answer. Callum's hand slid to the back of his neck, anchoring him in place. "Are you?" Tony's lips curved, the ache in his chest lifting into something luminous. "Try leaving me now." And the ballroom, the city, maybe even the war itself. All of it blurred away in the brightness of that moment. Chapter 6. The Isle, the Enemy, the Endgame. The cathedral's bells rang out in a slow, resonant rhythm that seemed to reach into every chest and set every heart beating to their command. Outside, the steps were awash with white roses, petals scattered by children in cream suits, the scent drifting into the late afternoon air. Press cameras flared in intervals, catching glimpses of arriving guests. Nobles in silk hats, industrialists in sleek tuxedos, philanthropists in jewel-toned gowns. The city had come to see a spectacle, and to whisper about whether it was love or another salvo in the Blackthorn War. Inside, the vaulted ceilings drank up candlelight and scattered it across gilded trim and stained glass windows. Rows of guests sat in reverent silence, heads turning as the first notes of the organ swelled. At the end of the aisle, Callum Blackthorn stood. For once, the icy composure that defined him cracked. His shoulders were square, but his hands trembled at his sides, betraying nerves he could not mask. His usually sharp, impassive face was softened, eyes glassy under the cathedral light as he fixed them on the grand oak doors. He looked like a man at the edge of a battlefield, braced for impact, waiting for the one person who made the fight worth anything at all. The doors opened. Tony stepped through. The world seemed to hold its breath. He wore white silk that clung and flowed in equal measure, the kind of garment that moved like water, catching every flicker of candlelight. His soft brown hair was brushed back to reveal his face fully, glowing with quiet certainty. The diamond Callum had given him gleamed on his hand, catching eyes and lenses alike. And yet it was not the silk, not the glow, not the diamond that made the room gasp. It was the look on Tony's face. Radiant, unshaken, a man who had walked through humiliation and come out untouchable. Tony's hazel eyes found Callum's instantly. 1,000 cameras clicked, but neither man seemed to notice. The aisle was long, yet it felt like a straight line, a tether pulling them together. Step by step, Tony came closer, the world blurring around him, until finally he stood at the altar. Callum exhaled, a sound almost broken. They faced each other, and the officiant's voice became a hum, words of ritual weaving through the sacred air, while their gazes clung like vows already spoken. When the time came for quiet promises, their heads bent toward each other, lips brushing the barest edge of privacy in a room full of onlookers. Tony's whisper trembled but was steady in meaning. "You started this to hurt him. You stayed to love me." Callum's hand tightened around his. His answer was rough, scraped from the core of him. "I'll spend forever proving it." A pause, a breath, a moment sealed without ink or pen, but with eyes locked and hearts uncloaked. "Then it's real," Tony whispered. "It's real," Callum swore. The officiant's voice rose. "You may kiss." But Callum didn't wait. He drew Tony forward, one hand at his jaw, and kissed him as though the world itself demanded witness. Not the harsh kiss of strategy, not the rough press of desperation. This was different, open, reverent, searing in its tenderness. Tony melted against him, fingers clutching his lapels, his lips parting in answer. The cathedral erupted, cheers, applause, cameras flashing like lightning. From the back of the cathedral, Blake watched. His face was pale, carved from disbelief, anger, and something emptier beneath. He had thought he could sabotage, charm, or reclaim what he had squandered. Now he stood alone, a spectator to a story that no longer had room for him. His glassy-eyed bitterness caught in the flares of camera lights, and then, quietly, he turned and walked out before the celebration could drown him whole. The reception unfolded in the estate gardens, transformed into a dream spun from string lights and blossoms. Lanterns floated like captive stars above long banquet tables heavy with champagne and roses. Musicians played soft violins while laughter threaded through the air. But for Tony and Callum, the world shrank to a circle of grass strung with fairy lights. Their first dance was not rehearsed. Callum's hand slid around Tony's waist with a reverence that belied the steel of his frame, and Tony leaned into it, fingers resting lightly at Callum's collar. The music swelled, but neither moved in practiced steps. They swayed slowly, foreheads pressed together, letting the rhythm of each other's hearts lead. Tony closed his eyes, listening to the quiet between them, feeling the certainty in the way Callum held him. No audience, no cameras, no game. Just the man who had once said stay and had meant it. Callum's lips brushed his temple. "You sure?" he murmured, low enough that no one else could hear. Tony smiled against him, the warmth of it catching at the edges of his voice. "Try leaving me now." The violins swelled, the lights blurred, the night folded around them like a vow. And in the stillness of his own heart, Tony thought, he told everyone I was just a friend. Now I'm a husband. To someone who never once doubted what I was worth. The world could watch. The cameras could flash. But Tony knew, as Callum's hands held him steady under the soft glow of string lights, that this was the end of a war and the beginning of a life.